How Singapore actually got rich with no resources. Imagine. It's August 9th, 1965. You're 41 years old, Cambridge educated, a lawyer who accidentally became the leader of a country that wasn't supposed to exist. Your name is Lee Kuan Yew. You're sitting under studio lights that feel like a punishment. The air is thick, sweat clings to your collar. Your throat is dry, not from heat, but from dread. You're about to speak to 1.8 million people. For most nations, Independence Day is a celebration. Flags, fireworks, champagne. A triumphant story of liberation. The kind of day where history feels like a parade. But for you, it's a funeral. You are not celebrating freedom. You are mourning an eviction. Singapore has just been kicked out of Malaysia, expelled, dumped, forced into independence like a man thrown off a ship in the middle of the ocean. Let that sink in. Most countries fight for sovereignty. Singapore was forced to be sovereign because nobody wanted it. And when you run the numbers, when you stare into the balance sheet of this newborn state, you understand why every foreign newspaper is taking bets on your death. Because the math looks like a death sentence. You have no natural resources, no oil, no gas, no gold, no farmland, not even enough fresh water to keep your people alive without piping it from the neighbors who just rejected you. Your land is mostly swamp and squatter settlements. Your economy is balanced on a single fragile pillar: British military bases that are openly preparing to leave. Your country has no army, no strategic depth. No hinterland, just a tiny Chinese majority island surrounded by larger Malay Muslim nations that look at you with suspicion. In 1965, GDP per capita is around $500. That's not developing. That's a third world slum with a port attached. The New York Times is betting you won't last a year. The British are betting you won't last 6 months. And then it happens. You break on live television. Not the theatrical tears of a politician trying to look human. Not a victory cry, real tears. A man staring into the abyss, realizing that if he fails, 1.8 million people don't struggle. They starve. That's why he's crying. Because independence didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a countdown. But now, fast forward, that swamp is now one of the most expensive cities on Earth. Singapore's GDP per capita sits above $80,000 higher than the former colonial master, the UK, and even the United States. It has one of the world's best airports, best schools, and a military that punches far above its weight class. It is clean, efficient, globally connected, air-conditioned financial vault with a skyline that looks like the future. So the question isn't how did Singapore get rich? The question is, how did Singapore survive long enough to get rich? Because what you're looking at isn't simply good policy, it's something darker. Something closer to a corporate takeover than a national origin story. Singapore didn't become a country, it became a company. Singapore Inc. And like any startup running out of cash, it didn't have the luxury of ideology. It didn't have time for debates. It didn't have room for romantic mistakes. It had one obsession. Does it work? If the answer was yes, Singapore did it. If the answer was no, Singapore killed it. Tevin, if it was popular, even if it was cultural, even if it was emotionally painful. And here's the uncomfortable truth Western audiences struggle with. Singapore didn't get rich by being nice. It got rich by being ruthlessly pragmatic. It used discipline as a weapon, order as a product, integrity as a marketing strategy, fear carefully directed as fuel. It treated the nation like a balance sheet, okay? And it treated survival like a contract. In this documentary, we're going to break down the machinery behind the miracle. Not the tourist version, not the Instagram version, the real mechanism. How Singapore created a government so clean it became a competitive advantage. An investor environment so stable it pulled capital from chaos. A workforce engineered for global industry. A housing system that turned citizens into stakeholders. And a social contract so strict it made the country feel like Disneyland with the death penalty. But first, we have to confront the central paradox. Singapore is proof that you can become rich without resources. But it's also proof that wealth always has a price. And Singapore doesn't hide the price tag. In the next section, we're going straight into the first pillar of Singapore Inc. The one most people whisper about because it's politically uncomfortable. The benevolent dictatorship. How Lee Kuan Yew used power tight, disciplined, and sometimes frightening to scare a fragile nation into prosperity. And why, unlike most dictatorships, this one didn't collapse under its own corruption. The benevolent dictatorship. How to scare people into prosperity. To understand Singapore's miracle, you have to start with the part that makes polite democracies uncomfortable. Because Singapore did not begin as a love story, it began as an emergency. A CEO's emergency. Lee Kuan Yew didn't govern like a typical politician who needs to win tomorrow's headlines. He governed like a man staring at an empty bank account, knowing payroll is due in the morning. In the 1960s, Southeast Asia was a region of coups, riots, corruption, and fragile states. In that environment, freedom wasn't the ultimate currency. Order was. And Singapore made a cold calculation that Western nations rarely admit out loud. Democracy is a luxury you can only afford once you're not starving. So the People's Action Party PAP built a system that traded certain freedoms for stability, jobs, and safety. A social contract written in iron. You give up some rights. The right to protest loudly. The right to form disruptive unions. The right to attack institutions freely. The right to turn politics into a permanent street fight. And in return, the state guarantees something far more tangible. A functioning society. A job, a home, a safe street at 3 a.m. Call it what you want, soft authoritarianism, managed democracy, illiberal capitalism. The point is, Singapore chose control, not chaos. But here's the turning point where the Singapore story diverges from the graveyard of failed dictatorships. Most countries that centralize power do the same thing next. They steal. They install cousins. They build palaces. They buy golden toilets. They turn the treasury into a private buffet. Singapore did something rarer, and in a way, more frightening. It weaponized integrity. In a region where bribery was a daily tax, Singapore decided corruption would not be part of the culture. It would be treated like treason. They built a Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau CPI beyond. They didn't make it symbolic. They gave it teeth. Sharp, predatory teeth. It reported directly to the Prime Minister. It could investigate anyone. It could dig through your accounts, your spouse's accounts, your mistress's accounts. And it operated on a rule that terrified officials more than prison. If your lifestyle exceeds your income, you can't explain if you are guilty. This wasn't theory. It was enforced. And the most chilling proof came in 1986. A senior minister, a powerful man named Det Ching Wan, was accused of taking bribes worth roughly $800,000 in today's money. In many countries, that's where the story ends. The investigation loses paperwork. A friendly judge delays the trial. A pardon appears quietly. In Singapore, the machine moved forward. CPIB interrogated him for hours. He tried to call Lee Kuan Yew on an old friend to request a meeting. Lee refused. No mercy meeting. No private backroom deal. No shield. And then, on the morning he was expected to be charged, the minister was found dead in overdose with a suicide note, admitting shame and accepting the highest penalty. Lee's response was not sentimental. He had the note read aloud in Parliament. To outsiders, it felt cold, even cruel. But to investors, it was a signal as loud as a siren. If we will destroy one of our own founding elites over corruption, imagine how safe your money is here. Singapore marketed morality like a product. Okay. In global finance, predictability is priceless. Corruption is unpredictability. So Singapore sold the opposite. And then came the second half of the anti-corruption strategy, the part almost no one talks about because it sounds like heresy. They paid officials like top executives. Lee understood something brutally practical. If you pay ministers peanuts, you don't get saints. You get corrupt monkeys. So Singapore tied senior government salaries to private sector benchmarks. The result is a state where top ministers and the Prime Minister earn salaries that can reach 7 figures. To Western audiences, it sounds obscene. But Singapore's logic was simple. We'd rather overpay competent managers than underpay people who will steal, sabotage, or underperform. This is why Singapore's government became part technocracy, part corporate boardroom. Economists, engineers, planners people, chosen less for charisma and more for competence. In a region of instability, Singapore turned itself into a boring, air-conditioned vault. And that boring became the miracle. But a clean government and a stable court system are only the foundation. You cannot live on integrity. You still need to make money. Singapore had no land, no resources, no domestic market. So it decided to sell the only thing it had in abundance, its labor. But that raises the next impossible question. How do you take a population of poor, undereducated workers, dockhands, fishermen, coolies, and turn them into the people who build microchips? In the next section, we're going to reveal the move that made Singapore indispensable to the world, the sellout strategy. While other newly independent nations kicked out foreign capital in the name of pride, Singapore did the unthinkable. It begged foreign capital to come in, and it worked. The sellout strategy. How Singapore plugged itself into the world in the 1960s. There was a fashionable idea sweeping the post-colonial world. It sounded righteous. It sounded defiant. It sounded inevitable. Kick out the West. Nationalize assets. Build domestic champions. Prove you can stand on your own. This doctrine had a name: import substitution. Latin America embraced it. Africa experimented with it. Singapore's neighbors flirted with it. Singapore looked at it and quietly refused. Lee Kuan Yew and his chief economic architect, Goh Kang Swee, did something almost heretical for a young nation. They admitted the truth. Singaporeans didn't know how to build complex products. They had no technology, no capital, no scale, no domestic market big enough to learn on. Trying to create a Singaporean toaster in 1965 would have been economic suicide, expensive, unreliable, and unsellable beyond a population of 1.8 million. So instead of pretending to be proud, Singapore chose to be useful. They decided not to compete with global corporations. They decided to host them. This was the sellout strategy, and it was deliberate. Singapore created the Economic Development Board (EDB) with a mission so unglamorous it bordered on humiliating. Fly to the United States, Europe, and Japan and beg. Not ideologically beg. Practically beg. They knocked on the doors of companies that barely knew Singapore existed and said, "Bring your factories here. Bring your machines. Bring your blueprints. Bring your managers. We'll give you stability. We won't strike. We won't nationalize. We'll protect your property. And we'll make it profitable to sweeten the deal." Singapore offered something that made Western CFOs blink: zero corporate tax for 5 to 10 years. While other nations were seizing foreign assets in the name of sovereignty, Singapore was handing out keys. Critics mocked it. They called it dependency, neocolonialism, a race to the bottom. What they missed was the asymmetry. Singapore wasn't selling its future. It was renting its present to buy one. To make this work, the government built the Jurong Industrial Estate, a massive industrial zone carved out of swamp and mud. At first, it looked like a monument to delusion. Empty factories. Tenants. No buzz. Opponents called it Goh's folly. Then, in 1968, the first domino fell. Texas Instruments was looking to move part of its assembly operations offshore. Costs in the U.S. were rising. They considered Hong Kong. They considered Taiwan. Singapore's EDB officials didn't just pitch, they stalked. They promised something outrageous: a fully operational factory in 50 days. T executives laughed. Singapore replied, "Watch us." Permits were cleared, infrastructure was fast-tracked, workers were trained. Officials worked around the clock. 50 days later, production began. That single event changed everything. Once T committed, credibility followed. Then came Hewlett-Packard. Then General Electric. Then Japanese firms. By the 1970s, Singapore had become one of the world's largest exporters of hard drives. Here's the subtle brilliance. Singapore wasn't inventing the technology. It was absorbing it. Foreign firms brought machines and processes. Singaporeans learned how to operate them, then how to improve them, then how to manage them, then how to scale them. This is how learning actually happens in poor countries, not through slogans, but through exposure. While other nations were busy protecting inefficient domestic champions, Singapore was embedding itself into the global supply chain. It made itself indispensable. And that had a geopolitical side effect. No one planned, but everyone noticed. You don't invade a country where American, European, and Japanese multinationals have billions of dollars of equipment on the ground. Supply chains are quieter than armies, but just as effective. Still, factories alone don't create a nation. You can have jobs and still have instability. You can have growth and still have riots. Singapore's leadership understood something deeper. If workers live in slum SIF, they feel rootless, angry, disposable. They don't show up focused. They don't protect the system. They don't have anything to lose. Which brings us to the most psychologically sophisticated policy Singapore ever implemented. Housing, not as welfare, not as charity, but as control. In the next section, we're going to examine how Singapore used public housing, not just to shelter people, but to bind them to the system. The golden handcuffs. And why owning a home turned ordinary citizens into stakeholders of Singapore Inc. The golden handcuffs. How housing turned citizens into stakeholders. By the early 1960s, Singapore had jobs. Factories were opening. Foreign capital was arriving. Exports were climbing. But the country was still sitting on a powder keg. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in overcrowded squatter settlements. Wood, zinc sheets, open drains. Fires spread in minutes. Disease spread faster. These were not just slums. They were revolution incubators. Lee Kuan Yew understood something that many economists ignore, but every ruler learns the hard way. People who have nothing to lose are dangerous. People who own something become conservative. Then history handed him a brutal opportunity. In 1961, a massive fire tore through Bukit Ho Swee, destroying the homes of more than 16,000 people overnight. It was a humanitarian disaster. It was also a strategic opening. While the embers were still warm, Lee arrived on site and made a promise that stunned everyone. Everyone would be rehoused within a year, and he kept it. But he didn't rebuild the slums. He replaced them with concrete high-rise block stens, vertical, modern. This was the birth of the Housing and Development Board (HDB). Here's what made it revolutionary. In most Western countries, public housing is associated with failure, poverty, crime, neglect. In Singapore, public housing became aspirational, not because it was luxurious at first, but because it was ownership. Singapore didn't want tenants. It wanted stakeholders. So the government engineered a system that forced people to save, whether they liked it or not. The Central Provident Fund (CPF) was expanded into a mandatory savings scheme. A large portion of every paycheck today, up to 37% combined employer-employee contribution, was deducted before workers ever touched it. You couldn't spend it on holidays. You couldn't blow it on consumption. You couldn't opt out. But you could use it to buy an HDB flat. The system was circular, paternalistic, and brutally effective. The state took your money, built housing with it, sold the housing back to you, using your own savings. The result? One of the highest homeownership rates on earth, nearly 90%. And with ownership came alignment. If you own a 99-year lease on a 3-bedroom apartment on the 15th floor, your incentives change. You want stability. You want order. You want the economy to keep growing. Rioting suddenly feels expensive. This is why Lee famously observed, "People don't riot if they have a mortgage." But Singapore went further into territory that still makes liberal democracies recoil. Race. In the 1960s, Singapore had violent ethnic riots. Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities segregated naturally, clustering into separate neighborhoods. Left alone, this would have hardened into permanent division. So in 1989, the government introduced the Ethnic Integration Policy. Every apartment block was assigned racial quotas. If a block already had too many Chinese residents, a Chinese buyer was legally forbidden from purchasing their Ivan if they offered more money. Sellers were required to sell to a Malay or Indian buyer instead. It was explicit social engineering. Was it discriminatory? Yes. Did it violate pure market principles? Absolutely. Did it work? The race riots never returned. Singapore made racism inconvenient, not illegal, but impractical. Your neighbor, your elevator partner, your child's classmate belonged to a different group. Daily proximity did what slogans never could. This is the Singapore pattern in its purest form. Identify a social risk. Ignore ideological discomfort. Design around human psychology. enforce relentlessly. But even housing, savings, and factories weren't enough. To truly integrate into the global economy, Singapore had to do something even more painful. It had to amputate part of its own culture, language. In the next section, we'll examine the most controversial gamble of all, the decision to kill linguistic nationalism in order to survive globalization, and why teaching math and English may have been the most profitable policy Singapore ever implemented. The verdict: pragmatism over ideology and the price of survival. The language decision nearly tore Singapore apart. In the 1960s, most Singaporeans did not speak English at home. They spoke Hokkien, Cantonese, Teochew, Malay, Tamil. English was the language of colonizers, the language of humiliation. Nationalism said, reclaim your tongue. Identity said, restore your culture. Lee Kuan Yew said something colder. Nobody in the global economy speaks your dialect. Against riots, protests, and furious parents, the government forced English as the main language of instruction in all schools. Chinese language universities were shut down or merged. Teachers wept. Families felt betrayed. It was cultural amputation, and Lee knew it. Years later, he admitted it was one of the most painful decisions of his life. He alienated his own base. He sacrificed romance for arithmetic. But when globalization arrived, when finance, technology, and the internet rewired the world, Singapore was ready. A Singaporean engineer could call Silicon Valley without a translator. A banker could operate in London, New York, or Hong Kong seamlessly. The workforce became culturally Asian, but linguistically Western. Singapore turned itself into the universal adapter of the global economy. Then came the next leap: running the country like a balance sheet. Most governments are terrible capital allocators. They subsidize failure. They protect incompetence. Singapore did the opposite. State-owned companies were placed under holding structures and told something shocking: you will not be rescued. If the airline failed, it would be shut down. If the shipyard failed, it would die. No nationalism, no bailouts, no excuses. Fear created excellence, and the savings forced out of citizens through mandatory programs weren't left idle. They were invested globally: real estate, equities, infrastructure, turning a resource-poor island into a quiet financial heavyweight with reserves capable of absorbing global shocks. This was the final insurance policy. No oil, no gas, but enough capital to survive storms. Then there was defense. Singapore understood that wealth without security is an invitation. So it built a military doctrine for the small and surrounded. The poisoned shrimp, small enough to be eaten, toxic enough to regret it. Universal national service. Advanced weapons. Foreign training bases. A signal to neighbors and superpowers alike: we are open for business, but do not touch the merchandise. And finally, the social contract revealed its full price. Strict laws, heavy fines, corporal punishment, zero tolerance for drugs. Disneyland with the death penalty, as one observer put it. Critics call it dystopian. Supporters call it functional. And that's the point. Singapore never pretended you could have everything. It never promised freedom, safety, equality, low stress, and high wages all at once. It looked you in the eye and said, pick. Do you want safety? Pay with obedience. Do you want wealth? Pay with pressure. Do you want harmony? Pay with control. This is why Singapore is so unsettling to the modern world. It exposes the lie that most societies tell, that there are no trade-offs. Singapore is honest about the bill. And now comes the final test. The founder is gone. The founding family has stepped aside. The world is fragmenting. Great powers are colliding. Singapore sits between giants, rich but small, efficient but fragile, wealthy but stressed. Its fertility rate has collapsed. Its people are exhausted. Its cost of living is among the highest on earth. For the first time, young Singaporeans are asking a dangerous question. If we are this rich, why does life feel this hard? That question has no easy answer. And that's the real verdict. Singapore proves that pragmatism beats ideology. That discipline can create wealth. That order can be engineered. But it also proves that wealth does not end trade-offs. It only changes them. Singapore is neither utopia nor dystopia. It is a transaction. And in a world growing more unstable, more polarized, more chaotic, the Singapore model may not be an anomaly. It may be a preview. Whether that thought comforts you or terrifies you depends on how much you value chewing gum.